Shad. And even considering the difficulties we face in the modern day, we're actually living in an unprecedented time of prosperity. And when you look at those of us who are lucky to live in first world countries, even the hardest of our modern day times is still orders of magnitude better than the best times of the past. Certain times of the past. And when you look at some of the worst times of the past, it is shocking. Like truly. And it has caused me to honestly feel very lucky and blessed. And this is actually the subject of this video. We're going to be looking at one of the worst times of the past. In fact, some people say the greatest catastrophe that's ever befallen a society of people.
The Bourbonic Plague.
The Black Death. And I tell you what, when researching this video, I have been struck with such an overwhelming measure of a sense, a feeling of gratitude for the time I get to live in and the luxuries I get to enjoy. And before we dive into the Black Death, I do want to actually talk about one of my favorite luxuries of the modern day.
No way,
it is Audible. And they're doing something that's honestly really brilliant to help out those of us who stuck at home and need something to help occupy us. Audible has launched something called Audible Stories, and you can find them by going to stories.audible.com. where they have made available hundreds of audiobooks absolutely for free. Just right there. There's no strings attached. You don't need to sign up. You don't need to log in. You don't need to pay a cent. You just go to stories.audible.com and you can listen to a selection of brilliant audiobooks absolutely for free.
La Camisa Negra.
Wonderful, honestly. Now, in addition to that, regularly, when you go to, say, www.audible.com/Shadiversity, or if you're in the US, you text Shadiversity to 500-500, their standard deal is that you can get your first audiobook for free if you sign up to give them a try for a month. And in addition to that first free audiobook, you usually get 2 Audible Originals, which is an audiobook only available on Audible, and you get them for free. What Audible are doing now is opening up their selection of Audible Originals. So you get the first audiobook plus all their Audible Originals, okay? Access to them all to help people out pass the time during these difficult times. And if you are wondering which free audiobook you should grab, I would suggest my own audiobook, Chronicles of Everfall, Shadow of the Conqueror. It's a dark, epic fantasy. Even though it's fantasy, it deals with some of the brutal realities that happen from the choices that humans have made in the past. So if you like dark, challenging fantasy, I do recommend it. And you can grab that very audiobook and access to hours and hours of entertainment if you just go to www.audible.com/Shadiversity.
I know for a fact that my paladin that I just got this cage with headed 335 cash cage. Whatever.
As I begin pointing out some of the misconceptions of the
treasure
Black Death
chest,
and getting into the facts of what it was,
and now I'm kind of
happened,
pissed because my main character again it has not the highest item level of all my characters.
Researching this video, I did
that always happens.
So that might come back.
Doesn't matter which
it really got to me.
Expansion.
The reason being is that the more I learn of the past, the more real
it's always my fucking warrior that
far from being statistics,
owns my
facts,
paladin
I
at some
found them
point.
to be people, so similar to me. They had similar hopes, dreams, and desires. They wanted the best for themselves, their families, their loved ones, their children. And they worked to improve the world. Even if that's improving their own condition, that was working to improve the world. And they had to endure, I'm so lucky. And the things that they had to go through for what I take as such basic, some people even consider rights. It's a right to have these luxuries. They had to work pretty darn hard to just obtain heat in my home. I can press a button and warm my home. I don't need to break my back collecting firewood and keeping a fire burning all the time. I can have hot water on demand, instantly, whenever I want. I don't need to prepare anything for it. I can bring light into my home with the flick of a switch. I have access to healthy, tasty, plentiful food just by going down the street and getting it whenever I want. for the most part, okay?
Not if you will live in America, dude. And yes, I know you're not in America.
In the modern day. When I get an infection, I don't need to worry
Back in
about
Aussie.
And when the pandemic hits, I don't need to worry about my family dying or having to struggle with the decision that I might need to abandon them just to survive. This is how lucky we are in the modern day. These are some of the horrors that people had to endure. But they endured it to try and better their own life and better the lives of their children. And this is the thing that can get to me. We are their children. Ultimately, they did this for us, their descendants. And even with the difficulties that exist in the modern day, we are still so blessed. And we are positioned to endure it and survive it so much better. Thanks to them. So, what was the Black Death? It was a plague. One of the things that people don't actually understand is that there were several pandemics of the bubonic plague. Okay? The Black Death was actually the worst case of it, but the bubonic plague has arisen multiple times throughout the past, sometimes much closer to the modern day than you would expect. But the Black Death specifically was the worst case of it, and by far the most devastating. There have actually been 3 identified plague pandemics, and the first one arose about in the 6th century AD. Second, the Black Death, as I mentioned, the worst, and it was kind of like aftershocks of the Black Death, a bit arising in smaller pockets after the massive wave with such a huge death toll. But that is kind of all accounted within the event known as the Black Death. The third case of the plague pandemic was actually in Asia in 1890. And that one is actually where some of the misconceptions actually arise, specifically in how it was spread. But more on that later. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and would quickly spread across all of Europe, and would only come under a measure of control after a catastrophic loss of life by 1352. It took 5 years for this plague pandemic to run its course. One historian has dubbed it Magna Mortalitas for the sheer number of dead. One observer wrote that there was scarcely enough living to bury the dead. An Augustinian monk named Henry Knighton wrote this about the Black Death. There was a general mortality throughout the world. Sheep and oxen strayed through the fields and among the crops, and there was none to drive them off or collect them, but they perished in uncounted numbers for lack of shepherds. After the pestilence, many buildings fell into total ruin for lack of inhabitants. Similarly, many small villages and hamlets became desolate, for all those who dwelt in them had died. What was the percentage of death in the Black Death? And this
20%.
is the staggering thing. I want you to try and comprehend and process this number. With 60% of the population reduced from 80 million to 30 million.
What did I just say? 40?
50 million.
I meant to say 40. If I said something else, I just did it dumb. I thought it was 40.
But on a percentage scale, it's not even a fraction close to the scale that happened in the Black Death. So in World War II, an estimated 75 to 80 million deaths, which is unbelievable. I'm not trying to downplay it. Yet out of all the countries that were involved in World War II, ultimately that accounted for 3 to 3.7% of the population of the time.
Yeah, that was nothing.
We're talking about a loss in life for the population of medieval Europe of 60%. That is worse than the Thanos snap from Marvel Endgame, Infinity War and Endgame. Think about this. Think about over half of the people in your immediate circle dying. That's what we're talking about. Like,
and they didn't just evaporate, they died a pretty gruesome death.
Dispersion. There were pockets of much higher death, much lower deaths. As the account from Henry Knighton just mentioned, there were cases of whole communities just dying, completely wiped out. And there are some cases of communities that were very secluded and survived it without a single death. And then it all kind of balances out to where we reach this 60% figure. But think about it, there are cases of entire communities where everyone died. It's astounding and staggering, and I could only imagine how horrifying that would be. Because these are people in a much different situation than us. They had very poor medical technology at the time. More on that later. Even with the staggering amount of life lost, a medieval society, in some ways, were better equipped to weather such a loss of life than we are in the modern day. In the modern day, we are much better equipped to prevent the loss of life in the first place. So I'm not sure we could say that, it'd be better to be in the medieval period. But if we lost that amount of life in the modern day, our current society would collapse because our production chains have far more bottlenecks than in the medieval period. People of that time were actually far more independent and capable of supporting themselves than we are, okay? They knew how to grow their food, how to look after themselves much better than we do. If we lost the supply chains to our supermarkets and electricity and gas ceased coming to our homes, it would be a staggering amount of chaos of the likes that we have never seen. So that's one interesting kind of thing to compare about the medieval period, that they, even with the loss of life, even with how devastating it was, they were able to ultimately recover. Took a long time, of course, but they were able to continue on. And on this note of kind of comparing the modern day to the past, the bubonic plague of the Black Death spread a bit slower than what we see pandemics spread in the modern day. The world is far more connected in the modern day, and we see diseases jump instantly because of jets and other things. It took about a year for the bubonic plague to spread across Europe, from the places in which it first kind of appeared, which is like Italy and southern Eastern Europe and stuff, all the way across to Britain, about a year's time. But then it lasted for 5 years, having a massive death toll. So how did it spread specifically? And this is where we have one of the biggest misconceptions about the Black Plague, and that is the assumption that it was spread by the fleas.
It wasn't.
There's actually, when people have looked into this and studied in detail, there's no evidence for it. But there is evidence for a later plague, and that is being applied too broadly and assumed to have been the case for the medieval Black Death, when actually, in fact, it's not. No correlation has been found in the population of rats or reports of rat epidemics or other similar rodents during the time of the Black Death. And such a thing would have been made note of, that there were rats everywhere, because an interesting correlating thing does appear in the third pandemic of the plague. Okay, so remember there was like 3 main ones? In the third one, plague cases and deaths actually followed the same seasonal fertility cycle of certain species of rat fleas. That's where the correlation was found, and that's
what was it then?
But like I said, no such correlation exists with the medieval Black Plague. And in addition, there are correlating reports in later cases of the plague of rat falls. Think about what that word implies, rat falls, okay? That's the number of rats we're kind of talking about that correlate to when they're the main culprit of spreading the plague. And these are reports from Africa, also China, and they come from around the 18th century. So a rat fall kind of event like that would be very noteful to observe, and you'd think someone would have, made a record of it if such, an event, a scene like that, befell someone in the medieval period. But there's no account of that ever happened. So unfortunately, that video game, A Plague Tale, with rats everywhere, is not historical. I mean, it works fine for a fictional video game, but historically, that wasn't the case. How did the medieval plague then spread? And I'm going to read this one because there's some specific wording. It actually seems to be the case that the medieval bubonic plague was actually spread with the combined interplay between the bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plagues, which caused its spread to travel much faster than if it was limited to the migration patterns of rats. And so what we're actually seeing here, because this is the thing, I mean, rats, yes, they migrate, but not particularly fast, okay? And on the medieval scale, having a pandemic like this spread across an entire continent in this time of the year was relatively fast in comparison, and it wouldn't have been spread that fast if it was carried by rats. So it was actually spread through a very virulent version of the plague that had interplay and possibly even certain mutations with other types of, strains of, sicknesses and plague as well, which caused it to be far more patchy, unfortunately. And once again, that was the interplay between the bubonic, the pneumonic, and septicemic plagues. So it was pretty vicious. So this is the other thing that helps dispel the idea that rats were the ones that proliferated the spread of the plague. And it is that the spread of the plague, or rate in which it was spread, can be charted somewhat to about 1 mile a day, but in some cases up to 8 miles a day. And the other thing is, once rats migrate and find a place where they're happy, they stay. They stop moving. But the plague continued to spread at 1 mile a day. And you need to understand that medieval people didn't know, especially at first, what caused it, okay? Ultimately, they did resort to strict quarantine. In actual fact, one of the assumptions in what they believed spread the plague was in foul smell. Now, the miasmic kind of theory of sicknesses, which is what ultimately is miasma, is the idea that foul smell spreads sickness, got far more developed later on. And in the medieval period, it was an idea, and they did enact certain countermeasures to fight against bad smells. In 1349, Edward III of England wrote to the mayor of London, and he ordered the streets of London to be cleaned, and this was his quote: "The streets were foul with human feces, and the air of the city poisoned, to the great danger of men passing, especially in this time of infectious disease." And so that is again the idea that horrible smells carry disease. And this is when we come to another misconception of the Black Plague, and that is the plague mask that is very distinctive and iconic and associated with the Black Plague. But this is the thing, those plague masks didn't exist during the Black Plague. They're from the Renaissance, later, all right? Now, the logic behind these plague masks is actually tied with the miasmic theory of medicine, which is in bad smells. And so the whole purpose of this long nose was to put nice smelling, scented herbs, spices, and other things in that nose cavity so they could breathe in sweet, fresh, nice smelling kind of fumes to protect them from the foul fumes that carry disease. So it's tied with that theory, but the masks themselves didn't exist in the medieval period. They come from the doctors of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And it's just interesting to note that pockets of the plague did, appear during, times later, but not to the huge scale of the Black Plague, for a very significant reason, which I'll go into when I start to describe how they overcame it. Because once they overcame it, well, there was a bit more resistance to it because most people had died. But anyway, more on that later. So one other, point of evidence which dispels the rat myth is that there were some cities that were pretty big hubs of trade and commerce, which would have had a very high rat population in comparison, which actually survived fairly, or mostly unscathed from cases of the plague. And these are the cities of Milan and Douai. Horrible at pronouncing these words. Yeah, that's in Flanders. They actually survived the length of the Black Death nearly unscathed. So, if the rats were the ones carrying this, with people bringing trade goods in and out, with rats coming in with them and things like that, it would have hit these areas pretty severe that it did. In terms of remedies and ways to treat it, most of it was just hokum, okay? And there's actually an account from Chaucer that says many a doctor earned a pretty penny by peddling, so-called cures or remedies and stuff. But more often than not, the actual doctors of the time period weren't there to treat the disease because, if they were being honest, they didn't have anything they knew could treat it, and they were mainly there to just record the deaths. The most iconic symptom of the Black Plague are swellings, which can, look like either markings on the skin or growing kind of bulbous nodules almost. And these nodules can look like, swollen, sweaty, fleshy lumps, oftentimes appearing black or partially black. And they can grow from the size of a grape to the size of, say, an egg, and commonly appearing around the neck, armpits, and groin, but sometimes just across the whole body. Accompanying these swellings are feelings of lethargy, okay, so low energy, you feel horribly sick, of course, your whole body aching, a feeling of cold, yet at the same time you would have a really high fever, and you would cough up blood. So it's horrifying, it's terrible. This is just a vicious, horrible disease. And when people contracted it, they could die in a couple of hours, depending on the strain. I can imagine that. The more common rate of death would be within a day to 5 days of contracting the disease. I can only imagine how terrifying it would be, because some people could survive it, very few. But for the most part, it was a death sentence. If you contracted the Black Death, chances were you were going to die. And you could die in a couple of hours. And unless you were one of the lucky few to survive, a couple of days. So the other thing about this is how virulent the spread was. So if someone had this disease and you were in proximity to them, there's a very high chance, unless you were miraculously immune, you would catch it too. With the Black Death specifically, it affected all of society, okay? Whether you were rich, merchants, peasants, kings, clergy, it hit everyone. If you were in proximity, you could catch it. How did people deal with the Black Death? And this is where things can be really, really rough. Because
they burned a lot of stuff.
They didn't know how to treat it, and chances were, very high chances, if you contracted it, you would die. So what choices did people have? Heavy quarantine was practiced in many regions, and their quarantine period, 40 days sometimes. It kind of started to get lower and lower, but that's almost like 30 days, and then maybe 20. But the average seems to be between 30 and 40 days of full quarantine. Now, imagine how rough that would have been in the medieval period. They couldn't watch TV, they couldn't, listen to audiobooks, they couldn't play video games or any number of things. And I'm not saying quarantine isn't rough for us in modern day, I'm just saying it was so much worse for them, alright? And that's what they had to deal with. The other difficult thing about quarantine is that in the medieval context, you needed to work much more for your own survival, to get food, to keep yourself warm, especially in winters, and parts of winters that could hit certain parts of Europe, Britain, and so on. So if you had to be quarantined, how could you help, protect yourself? In some cases, one person was allowed to leave, but people would avoid him, of course. But in other cases, if it was a whole family or something like that, they would need to rely on other people's generosity to survive, bringing food, firewood, and other things to live, and they would just have to get by. If they could survive the quarantine, they would need to find ways to amuse themselves, sharing stories one to another, playing games and other things. But it would have been very rough and very difficult to get through. The scary thing is, a common practice would be if one person fell sick with the Black Death, they wouldn't know if there were other people in the household who might have contracted it but haven't had any symptoms appear yet, and so the whole house would need to be put down on quarantine. Sometimes this was enforced very aggressively. But if you quarantine anybody with someone who has the plague, that basically means everyone in that household is going to contract the plague, and it's only a matter of time until they all die, unless someone was lucky enough to be immune. And so, one person gets a Black Death, the whole household would die. But that is only in cases where it could be enforced. It comes down to personal choice. And there was an obvious reality that had struck many people, and that was near certain death or save yourself. For myself, I know if I contracted, and I was in that period, if I contracted the Black Death and I had symptoms, I would send my entire family away to try and save their lives. And I would happily die alone. Don't know what I would do if it was one of my children. But this is the choice that a lot of parents had to choose. Many chose to stay with their children and die with them, that they wouldn't have to die alone. I think that's what I would ultimately choose. But I understand the choice, and this wouldn't have been an easy choice, where sisters, brothers, children, and parents chose to abandon their loved ones so they wouldn't die as well. can only imagine how heartbreaking and difficult that would have been. That was a common thing that people had to do to survive. I would never blame or judge anyone for making that choice. I've certainly never been in such a situation. And I know if, as I mentioned, if I had such disease, I would want my family to move away. Of course, I don't think children would be able to be that emotionally mature. It would be hard for them to comprehend what was happening to them. But what a horrifying reality. Because just remember how lethal this was, how many people it killed. 60% of the population. And think about that account. Was it from Chaucer? Where entire villages just became ghost towns. Everyone had died. If you walk to that town, it would just be littered with corpses in there, either on the streets or in their homes. Death everywhere. And then the homes would start to fall into disrepair. Flocks of animals walking around unattended. It would be a hellscape. And of course, villages like that you would run away from, you would just avoid, like the plague, kind of an appropriate term that has arisen out of that, because that was the other way that people could try and protect themselves, was to avoid the plague like the plague. And if they used heavy quarantine measures, that was how they could ultimately survive. And of course, they needed to dispose of the dead, either going in, and it was hard to find the information as to how long the infection stayed on the corpses of people who had died from it, and what time it would be safe to actually handle the dead to bury them. Because if you went in and you'd want to, especially if it was a loved one and you cared for them, you would want to bury them, but because there is a time of infection shortly after death, you could get infected again. So sometimes, to protect anyone from getting infected, and if the whole family had died from this, if there was no risk of the fire spreading to other houses, they could just burn down the entire house to protect the surrounding community from the infection. The ultimate way in which the Black Plague had run its course was that really there were some people who escaped when they enacted heavy quarantine, but most people who were most susceptible to the disease had died from it. There's not really a thing like herd immunity, because it's not like you could survive it and build antibodies and just resist it from there on, because most people who got it simply died from it. And the population that remained were either the ones that practiced heavy quarantine or the ones that were more naturally resistant and immune to the disease. And that is why later kind of outbreaks of the plague weren't nearly as devastating as the main Black Plague, because the outbreak would hit an area where people were either more susceptible, hadn't hit before, or other things like that. But it was more difficult to spread because the population, in a large measure, unfortunately had their most vulnerable already die from it. The other thing that we need to understand about the Black Plague is that people still had to live their lives, all right? And so they had to risk, getting sick to plant crops, okay? Farm,
so I don't
food,
use that.
keep themselves warm, make clothing, any number of things to help people live. They still had to do. And so things just had to progress, and they had to deal with this horrifying danger of the plague. And if it arose in, your community, your family, it's a horrifying thing that you just have to deal with, potentially die from. But the people ultimately did survive. There was 40% that survived, and with the measures that they were able to put in place, sometimes worked, not always, but they were able to get through it and ultimately recover from it. And when I look back on this, like I said at the beginning of this video, I am just left with a profound sense of gratitude. I'm so lucky that I'm living today and not back then. And I'm grateful for the things that people of the past have endured to help bring us to the time we are living in right now, where the difficult times of the modern day are orders of magnitude better than some of the best times of the past. So thank you for joining me with this detailed look at the Black Plague, where we dispelled some of the misconceptions, but also learned a bit more about it and try and put ourselves in their shoes, figure out what it would have been like. I appreciate you watching the video, and of course I hope to see you again. Until that time, farewell.
This is so depressing. The other tank deals so much more damage than me. Can't get it. Aggro. What did I have to do for boss fight?
How dare you defile its temple?
Whoa. Holy crap.
Four, three, two, one. This temple shall perish. I need to be closer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Too far away.
I shall rip you apart myself!
3, 2, 1.
Service alive! I will tear your soul to shreds! Beneath my shadow!
I need to get closer.
Beware. Beware.
It's too far away.
I shall rip you apart myself!
4, 3, 2.
Servants arise! Your master calls! I will tear your soul to shreds!
against Nazoth.
Void corruption eradicated. Initiating anchor materialization.
Good riddance. Vexiona would see all dragons kneel before Nazoth.
I'm out of range. It's too far away.
Beware.
Potential anchor point detected in immediate vicinity.
Good. The sooner you place these anchors, the sooner we bring down Nazoth.
It's too far away. I need to get closer.
I shall peel the flesh from your bones!
Oh god, shit, oh god, I never pay attention to those, caustic roller, roly-polies, whatever. Kill bugs.
Replacement terminated.
Raden, it can't be. You're a servant of the Titans, of Azeroth herself.
Resolve opened my eyes to his great truth. He freed me from the narrow confines of the Titan's path.
I'm out of range. I don't have a target. Five, four, three, two, one. It's too far away. I'm out of range. I need to target something first.
I forgot what.
You only delay the inevitable.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The essence of the cosmos heeds my call. Weakness.
take a lesson from this, champions. Do not let N'Zoth wield your fears against you.
Witness the fate of this world. Behold, the one shall herald is coming.
My dear friends, a wondrous honor has been bestowed upon you. The chance to embrace your destiny, as I have. N'Zoth has shown me the inevitable truth that to save Azeroth, his gift.
Kneel and serve. I am the puppet!
Four, three, two, one.
Beware.
Five, four, three, two, one.
Beware.
Certain that it is best to take hold.
Signal interference negated. Connection restored.
You're back. What happened?
I learned that it doesn't take much for my friends to believe I betrayed them. Champions, that vision was as much for me as it was for you. N'Zoth wants us to believe that my corruption is inevitable. Doubt me if you must, but know that I will not rest until his smoldering corpse lies at my feet.
It's too far away. I'm out of range. I need to get closer. I'm out of range. Targets and ears.
Stretches before you. Join me and herald the coming age.
Yeah, I knew it. Haste is extremely good as tank right now. Or at least it was in the past. But I think it's still really good.
I need to get closer.
What is up, guys? Welcome back to the Nalf YouTube channel. I am Nalf. This is my YouTube channel. So, guys, Rudy and I were just guests, virtual guests, in a German high school for an English class. The teacher of this class was a foreign exchange student in Iowa where Rudy met her, and she asked Rudy if him and his stupid roommate would come be guests in her English class, talk with the students. They would be able to ask us questions about, you know, living in Germany, coming from America, American football, stuff like that. So yeah, that's what we did. So I'm going to be cutting back and forth between that and some other parts of my day / week, because that's just how I want to edit this video. And so, yeah, here we go.
Injuries and what kind and how many?
Yeah, actually it's both. We both broke our collarbones.
Got the same injury here. We have matching collarbone scars.
Yeah, so that was the biggest injury that I've had in football. So it happened out here.
I've had a lot of injuries, tons of injuries. My first year playing football, I broke my thumb, my hand, and my foot. And then in high school, I had like a really bad concussion where I got knocked out and I had to go to the hospital. And in college, I tore a ligament in my knee that's still messed up today. And then out here in Germany, like I said, I've broken my collarbone, I broke my finger. So yeah, a lot of injuries. Yeah, it's a very physical, dangerous sport, but it is worth it. Fun. Pain is worth it. Check out this mask. Christine, thank you so much for sending me these masks. These are football masks. Look how cool they are. Guile. Thank you, Christine. Much appreciated. I'm just having a wild craving for a cappuccino and 2 butter pretzels, so I'm running downtown right now to grab them. Hallo, ich hätte gerne eine Cappuccino bitte und zweimal Brot. 2-mal Butterbrot. Size. It is so good. That's a good butter pretzel. Real good butter pretzel right there. Oh, I can roll. I do. Yeah, we have them. I've gotten drug tested 2 or 3 times after games, and it's so. Have you gotten drug tested? Yeah. Oh yeah, you were. Me too. And so it's really weird because like right after the game, somebody comes up to you and like grabs you, an official, and they're like, "Hey, you've been randomly selected for doping test," and then they take you into this bathroom. Yeah, right.
It's a very awkward, situation and demoralizing.
But in short, yes, we do get drug tests. It's very weird. So, guys, there's been an official statement from the GFL that the plan is now to try and start our season on September 5th. So, I was thinking, it would be cool to go home and see my family right now during this time, because, you know, ball isn't gonna really start turning up probably until about July. So I've told a few people in Germany that hey, I'm thinking about going to go back to the States, see my family for a bit, and I keep getting very similar responses. There's something along the lines of, ooh, I would not want to be in the States. Like, aren't you afraid of going to the States? Don't you want to be in a safer country like Germany? And that's like the typical response when I say that. And I understand that point of view for sure. It's so weird to hear that though, because you never think about your home as some place like dangerous or bad, you know? Like imagine, like say if you're from Germany, imagine somebody saying like, "Ooh, I would not want to be in Germany." Like, "Ooh, don't you want to stay away from Germany?" It's just a really strange thought because you never think about your home in that way. And it's interesting to see how people from other countries see the United States. Oh no. A good explanation that I told my mom to get the perspective on this is like, You know how we look at Florida in the
Dude,
States?
whole lot
the
of
way we
people
look at
don't
Florida?
like the
That's
US
how
even
people
without,
in the rest of the world look at us in the
yeah,
United States.
the problem.
And I think that's a great explanation to give perspective to somebody in the States of how people look at us. So it's so strange to hear that from people in Germany, but I get it. Have any of you guys been to the States? And if so, what did you like about it and what did you not like about it?
Yes, I also haven't ever been to the States before, but I watched many YouTube videos, so I think it's very cool there.
Yeah.
Max?
I also have seen lots of videos about the States, but I've never been there. So I think in general it's cool. It's also different from like European lifestyle. But I think one big problem in the US is that the social system is not the best.
Yeah. It doesn't really exist.
Not really.
You just have to fend for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've already been twice. One time at Florida, Miami.
Nice.
And the second time in New York and Atlanta. Yeah, so it depends on where you go. If you go to Florida, the ocean, you can go there and that's great. And in New York, it's just amazing with the huge city and you have everything there.
I've also never been in the US before, but I saw a lot of videos. There are big cars and it seems like everything is symmetrical and yeah.
Nice.
Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video on a channel called The Beat with Alan Parr, in which Alan attempts to answer the question of why God created Satan in the first place, knowing full well that Satan would ultimately be responsible for messing up everything else that God ever made. So let's take a look.
Recently, someone asked me this question. They said, Brother Alan, why in the world would God create Satan knowing that Satan was going to rebel against him and cause all of the problems that we have today?
Yeah, that is a great question. God knows everything that will ever happen, so for every action that God takes, he can look into the future and see all the little butterfly effect consequences of that action. So naturally, he didn't think twice about creating the being who would be responsible for all of his other plans being messed up.
Okay, so this is a valid question, right? I mean, if God is all-knowing and he knew that Satan was going to rebel against him and we were going to have total and complete chaos on the earth, why in the world would God create Satan in the first place, right?
Exactly.
Wouldn't it make sense for him to just create all the good angels and then just not deal with Satan at all, and then life would be a lot better? Well,
right. As I have said in previous videos, usually with regards to people rather than angels, but the same thing still applies here. God is directly involved in the creation process of the angels, and he knows exactly which choices each of the angels he is making will make throughout their existence. And somehow this is still compatible with free will. Okay, sure, let's pretend that doesn't just immediately throw free will out the window. He could still just not make the angels who would freely choose to do bad things, and the good angels that he does make will still have free will.
To answer that question, I want to build upon 5 premises, and each time I want to build on the previous one. Premise number 1 is that God did not create robots.
Yeah, that's the free will thing. I don't really see how free will is possible if God actually is all-knowing. Like, I get it that knowing the future does not necessarily mean that you are responsible for all of the choices that go into making that future happen, But if you also want this all-knowing being to be responsible for the creation of everything, then that negates the free will thing, because he knows in advance all of the downstream effects of each creation event. So how he chooses to create will change the course of events regardless of the will of those he creates. So what it comes down to is that if you want free will to actually be a thing, then you cannot have God being both all-knowing and the creator of everything.
We need to understand and accept the fact that whenever God created angels and also ultimately mankind, he created all of us with free will.
But really, how is it possible to create something with free will when you know every single interaction that that thing will have in its existence, and you know exactly how the way you are creating it will affect how it handles these interactions, and you know how to create it differently to make it handle those interactions differently? Any choice you make in how to create it will have downstream consequences on how it handles these interactions, and you know all of the branching trees of possibility for every single one of these creative choices, but somehow the thing that you make still has free will?
He created us with the ability to choose to obey, to choose not to obey, to choose between good and evil.
And he knew all of these choices in advance, and yet still chose to make beings that would make choices that would negatively affect everything else that he ever did.
And if God would have controlled Satan in such a way that it was not possible for Satan to choose evil instead of good, then God would also have been removing free will, which would have been against his original intent for creation.
Which then raises the question, if the existence of free will resulted in all of the evil that exists, then is free will really a good thing? Now, keep in mind that the Bible never actually says that God gave anyone free will, and in fact, depending on your translation, it even explicitly states that God created evil, so you don't need free will to explain the existence of evil. In fact, when you were going back to the Hebrew that Isaiah 45:7 was originally written in, it looks like there isn't really room for interpretation. It's evil, wickedness, mischief, misery, bad stuff. So the Bible agrees that God creates evil. The Bible also says of people who end up in hell that it would have been better for them to have never existed than to end up in hell. The Bible also says that it's just better in general to not exist than to live and witness the great evil of the world. And the Bible also says that more people will end up in hell than in heaven. So the Bible makes it quite clear that it is better to not exist than to exist. And that it is better to not exist than to exist and end up in hell. And it also says that more people will end up in hell than in heaven. So God knew in advance that this would be the ultimate result of everything that he did. And he did it anyway. So God gave everyone free will, knowing that Satan would end up causing the majority of the people that he would ever make to end up in hell.
Still not over.
Proceeded to make the people that would end up in hell, then admitted in his book that it is better to never exist than to end up in hell, then told us flat out in his book that more people will end up in hell. So ultimately, it would have been better if he had just not created anyone at all. The Bible essentially says that God's plan is a bad plan, because not having created all the people would have been a better plan. Well, for the people anyway. God could have had some reason that made the creation of everything better for himself, but he did flat out tell us in the Bible that non-existence would have been better for us.
Now, with that being said, premise number 2, why did God create angels in the first place? Well, the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, that angels were created to serve and to worship God.
So, God is a lazy narcissist?
It says here, therefore, angels are only servants, spirits sent to care for people who will inherit salvation.
Yeah, God is a lazy narcissist. So God is all-powerful, omnipresent, and all-knowing, which means that anything that needs doing, it literally takes him no effort just to do it himself. But then he went and made servants that could take care of things for him, things that take zero effort. And these servants also have to worship him. So not only do they do all his stuff for them, which would take him no effort, but the whole time they're doing his dirty work, they have to be constantly talking about how awesome he is. Forget Satan. Why did God need to create any of the angels?
So we must understand that God's initial or original intent in creating Satan, which we'll talk about in just a moment, was for him to worship God and for him to serve God, just like the other angels do.
So he created the ultimate evil being, knowing full well that he would turn evil, but intended for him to stay good? But then he knew that the way he was creating him was going to wind up with him being evil? This doesn't quite add up.
Now, with that being said, the third premise, and I'm actually going back on something I said a moment ago, is that God did not create Satan. God actually created Lucifer.
That's just semantics. It doesn't matter. God created him good, knowing full well that he would turn evil. Just because the name changed when the switch happened didn't mean that God didn't create him. Also, if we do want to play semantics and be technical with this sort of thing, the passage in Isaiah names Hillel ben Shara, which translates to Shining One Who Makes the Morning Rise in the Greek text, which then turned into Lucifer in the Latin Vulgate. And also, the context of this Isaiah passage is meant to be a poetic taunt against a tyrannical ruler who is brought down by his own pride and ambition, and was explicitly about the king of Babylon. So the Shining One Who Makes the Morning Rise was not Satan, it was the king of Babylon, which then turned into Lucifer over 2 translations.
So we have to understand that the word Lucifer is a positive name. It's a beautiful name. It actually describes God's most beautiful created angel of all time.
Ah, you have the Ezekiel passage about Lucifer up there. That one is similar to the Isaiah passage, but with a few key differences. But once again, when read in context, we find out that this is about an earthly ruler who fell from power. This time it's the king of Tyre. Your whole idea of the Satan story and his fall from grace seems to be taken more from Dante than from the Bible. As Marvin Tate, the senior professor of Old Testament interpretation at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, concluded in his 1992 paper on the subject, no passage in the Old Testament has to do directly with Satan in the sense of later literature and Christian theology. So a guy who works in the Old Testament interpretation department of a Baptist seminary whose mission statement is to be totally committed to the Bible as the Word of God came to the conclusion that the character of Satan as understood by Christians does not exist in the Old Testament. And yet here you are giving us Satan's backstory that is cobbled together from unrelated verses about various rulers of earthly kingdoms as if that is supposed to explain anything about him. Like, seriously, read your Bible. It says at the beginning of both the Isaiah and Ezekiel passages who those passages are about. In Isaiah, it is in the section titled Israel's Remnant Taunts Babylon, and the verse right before the poem starts is, "You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon." At the beginning of the part in Ezekiel 28 that talks about Lucifer, it again makes it quite clear that it is about a human king. Hell, you don't even have to go outside the verse that you yourself had referenced on the screen. Ezekiel 28:12 starts with, "Son of man, raise a lamentation upon the king of Tyre." So now we go from the question of why did God create Satan to why doesn't the Bible actually mention God's main adversary until the last 25% of the book? Can you imagine how the Harry Potter series would have played out if Voldemort was never mentioned until about a quarter of the way through the 5th book? So God didn't see fit to even mention to people that Satan exists until 100 years before he came down to earth to defeat Satan as Jesus, and then only if you look at extra-biblical Jewish sources, because there's no mention of him in the Bible before the New Testament. And even then, it can still be argued from how the language is used that the character of Satan was still not really present, except maybe in Revelations, but was inferred in later translations.
It means the son of the morning dawn. Now, the words Satan and the devil and other names are names that has been assigned or attributed to Lucifer as a result of him making the decision to turn away from God.
Except the term Satan is never used in the Old Testament or the Gospels as a proper noun. Now, I'm not sure about the rest of the New Testament, but even when Jesus is tempted in the desert, when looking at the original Greek, there is never a proper noun used to describe the person who is doing the tempting. It is always satanas, the Greek word for adversary, which is not a proper noun by itself and is not used as such. In Matthew, he did use the word Beelzebub to describe the master of demons, but that's the closest the Gospels get to an actual Satan character. But hey, I'm not really here to argue theology. I can agree that there are the beginnings of a character that eventually morphed into what we now know as Satan today in the Gospels, but the Old Testament is completely devoid of such a character, as are any Jewish writings from before the 1st century BCE.
And these words are more negative in nature, such as Satan means adversary, and the devil, and so on and so forth.
Satan means adversary, yes. like when the Bible refers to King David as a Satan to the Philistines. Satan was not necessarily a negative term, it was just a term used for an adversary.
So the idea is this: God created Lucifer with free will. Lucifer then exercised that free will to choose evil instead of good. And at that time, his name was changed from Lucifer to Satan.
Not only is this story not backed up in the Bible, but all my original points about God knowing that how he made Satan would lead to Satan becoming Satan rather than Lucifer still stand. So far, we've got God having made an angel, knowing he will become Satan eventually, and then going a few thousand years at least before telling humanity about the evil being who wants them all to burn in hell.
But just because Lucifer chose evil rather than good does not mean that God was responsible for that evil any more than God is responsible for murder, right?
No, absolutely not. If you want God to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and to have created everything, then God is absolutely responsible for everything that happens, because he knew that his creative acts would eventually cause all those things to happen. You cannot have it both ways. The only way for God to not be directly responsible for every bad thing that has ever happened is for God to have limits on his power and or knowledge.
If God creates a human being, God doesn't create a murderer. That human being makes the conscious choice to murder someone. If God creates a human being, God doesn't create thieves. He creates human beings who at some point in their life choose to steal from someone.
But God created that human being with that particular genetic code that would lead to that person's particular dispositions, which, when combined with the environment that God put that human being into, would lead to that human being being a murderer or a thief. And God knew the whole time that all these factors would add up and lead to that human being a murderer or thief. Therefore, God created the murderer or thief. If I program a robot to repeatedly swing an axe around, and then I put that robot into a room full of babies, I have just made a baby-killing machine and should be held responsible. But God gets a free pass because reasons?
In the same way, the Bible says that everything that God created was good. It was very good. It was beautiful.
So that directly contradicts the verse about God creating evil, then? What about the lying spirits that he sends to people occasionally? Is a lying spirit a good thing? What about hell? Did God not create hell? Is hell good? See, stuff like this is why I can't pretend that the Bible is the perfect inerrant word of God. It can't even stay internally consistent.
But Lucifer chose to exercise his free will in the direction of evil. Think of it this way: if you raise your children up with godly principles and one day they murder somebody or they turn away from you, is that your fault, right? Are you completely and totally responsible for the decisions that your children make?
To a certain degree, yes. Parenting can have a drastic impact on what kind of an adult a child becomes. That being said, no parent is in 100% control of their child's temperament, genetics, and environment. God, however, was. He could have provided the best temperament and environment to Lucifer, or just chosen not to make the angel that he knew would mess everything up. If you can somehow make free will fit into a system where the guy who controls everything also knows everything and every possible alternative outcome, then surely you can take this a step further and still maintain free will when God just chooses not to make those that will freely choose evil. He's not coercing the choice in those that he does make, he's just not making those who he knows will make the evil choice.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, sometimes the kids are outside of my control, and sometimes, as a parent who is fallible, I do the wrong thing. But since everything is in God's control and God is perfect, he doesn't get the same escape from responsibility that I do.
In the same way, God is not responsible for the decisions that we make.
Yeah, but he made the decision to make us while knowing what decisions we would make, so he kinda is responsible for those decisions. There's really no way out of this without giving up one of God's omnis.
God does not control the things that we do, because if he did, he would once again be removing free will, which is against what he initially intended for his creation.
How do you know that he initially intended free will for his creation anyway? And how does God decide which people to make and which not to make? He does make those decisions. There are an infinite number of potential possible people that could exist, any of which he could choose to make at any time. He chooses not to make an infinite number of people, but to limit the number. Each person that he makes, he does so while knowing all of the choices that person will make in their life. So when he makes someone, even if you can technically say he's not making their choices for them, he does know their choices, and he has chosen to make that person instead of some other potential person who would have made different choices. So God has an infinite number of options for people that he could make for every pregnancy, but he narrows it down to usually just one option. And sure, let's say that doesn't count as God making the choices for that person, but God has now chosen which choices will be made by choosing to make the person that would make those choices. So even if free will were possible here, God is still directly responsible for all the choices ever made, because they all come back to his choice of which people to make when. Now, with people, you could make a bit of an escape hatch for this, because God has placed limits on his potential choices in the mechanisms of genetics and how sexual reproduction works, but this only pushes the problem back a step, as God is the one that set that system up, but I'll allow it. Lucifer, though, would have been a direct creation of God, not an indirect product of a sloppy reproductive mechanism. And yeah, I mean sloppy in every sense of the word.
Premise number 4 is that evil is present so that God can demonstrate his love towards us.
Okay, so I've been jumping around a bit, but let's just get back to the premise of this video. God created Lucifer with free will. Lucifer freely chose to become the evil being Satan, and then tricked Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden into eating the forbidden fruit, resulting in the fall of humanity. So God allowed the paradise that he created for humans to enjoy to be destroyed so that he could show us that he loves us? Let's not even go that broad. God allows babies to get cancer to show us that he loves us. He invented parasites that invade our bodies and cause pain, weakness, blindness, and death to show us that he loves us. Really? That's called an abusive relationship. You know, the whole I only hit you because I love you thing? Yeah, that's not a healthy relationship.
So the real question that we really need to be asking here is not necessarily why did God create Satan, but why did God even create me? Why did God even create you?
Good question. Assuming I don't become a Christian again before I die, he created me knowing that I would end up in hell. And it says in the Bible that it is better to never have existed than to end up in hell. So it would have been better for me to have never existed. So God could not have created me because he loves me, or else he would have done what was best for me and never have created me in the first place. This same thing applies to anyone that dies and goes to hell.
Because we are just as guilty as Satan, because Satan's initial sin, Lucifer's initial sin rather, was to walk in pride. He was not content with his position in heaven and wanted something more.
Oh, and there's the Isaiah passage, the one about the king of Babylon. Okay, fine. Satan walked in pride and that was his sin. Sure, let's grant this completely unsubstantiated claim. How does that justify punishing me for the sins of Adam and Eve? Why did their actions destroy paradise for everyone? Could God not have whisked their children back to Eden when they had them and let them make their choice for themselves? Why does every human being start off with a negative tally sheet because of something they didn't even do?
In the same way, I don't know about you, but there are times whenever I walk in pride. There are days whenever I walk in disobedience as well.
Yeah, pretty sure that if the Bible God does exist, my YouTube channel is a big walk of disobedience for me. And I do try to avoid being prideful, but there is a healthy kind of pride. I mean, I'm proud of my kids, most days. I'm proud of my accomplishments.
Give me an enema.
An enema?
Yes. You'll give him a feeling of accomplishment.
But no, I don't walk around talking about how great I am. In fact, when people meet me in real life and find out I have a YouTube channel, I usually try and convince them not to watch it because I know my content is very niche and most people won't appreciate it or care about what I say. So I do have good pride sometimes, and yeah, sure, I've probably had bad pride at least on occasion, but that still doesn't answer why two people's choice to eat a fruit punishes the whole world, plants, animals, and everything.
But it's only in the presence of evil where God's love can brightly shine.
How does that make any sense whatsoever? I don't make my kids suffer so they can appreciate my love more when I'm nice to them. What you are describing is not a loving relationship. It is an abusive one.
But the fact that we choose to disobey God every single day and yet he still continues to pursue us is a demonstration of his love.
Now, take those words out of a religious context and put them in the context of any loving relationship here on Earth. Now tell me if they are still loving words. My wife wouldn't obey me, but I'm still chasing her down, intent on ending up with a good, obedient wife so that I don't have to torture her later. The fact that I'm still chasing and pursuing her is proof that I really love her.
And that type of love can only shine in the midst of darkness.
My love for you can only truly shine if I make things hard for you. Dead babies? That's my love for you. Disease? Shiny, shiny love. The existence of Jurassic Park 3?
Alan.
That's love.
Premise number 5 is that God is the knower of evil, but not the cause of it.
Not according to the Bible. Also not according to the necessary consequence of God having all the omnis that Christians like him to have. If he knows that his action of creating a being with free will result in evil, and he still chooses to create that being, then he has just caused all of the evil that he knew that being would cause when he created it.
So sometimes people say, well, didn't God know this was going to happen? Sure, he knew it was going to happen. That doesn't mean he is the cause of it, right?
How does that follow at all? If I adopt a tiger knowing full well how dangerous they are, but just let it wander around my house like a pet cat, is it my fault when that tiger inevitably injures or kills one of my family members? Yes, absolutely, because I knew the danger and chose to get the tiger anyway. It's even worse with God, because while it could be said that I knew of the potential danger to bringing a tiger into my home, God didn't know the potential evil that would happen as a result of his creation. He knew exactly what evil would happen for sure as a result of his creation. When he was creating his angels, he knew full well that Michael and Gabriel would be good protectors of his favorite tribe of people. You know, because in the Old Testament it's made quite clear that God favors one particular tribe over everyone else on earth, like a good loving parent who has favorite children. And when he created Lucifer, he knew full well that Lucifer would end up leading a rebellion, and that would end up with the unfathomable suffering of the people that he was going to create later, and that would result in the vast majority of them burning in hell for all eternity. But then he went ahead and created Lucifer anyway. And why did he create the angels? Because he wanted servants. Not needed servants, wanted servants. Because he is all-powerful, so the most difficult task would be super easy for him, but he didn't want to have to do everything himself, even though it would be easy, so he just made others to do the jobs that are beneath him. And those others also had to tell him how amazing and great he is all the time while doing his dirty work.
Any more than if I'm looking at a building and I see a plane that's getting ready to crash into that building. I know it's going to happen. I can see it happening, but I'm not the cause of that. I'm not the person that's driving or flying that plane. I'm not the person that put it into the mind and into the heart of the pilot to crash that plane into that building.
This analogy doesn't really hold up, because if you want this to be an analogy for God, then God made the pilot, knowing full well that the pilot would eventually fly the plane into the building, and you could have chosen not to build the pilot, or to build him with a disposition that would lead him away from wanting to fly planes into buildings. This analogy only works if you are placing limits on God's knowledge or power. In order to take the burden of responsibility away from God, he has to either not know all the potential choices that will be made by the people that he chooses to make, or he doesn't actually have an active hand in making all the people, like the Bible says he does. In fact, these limits are actually fairly easy to justify biblically, because the Bible often depicts God as a fallible being who doesn't know everything and needs reminders to, not commit genocide, at least not with the same method that he already used. So, yeah, if you want God to actually not be responsible for all the evil of the world, then you have to take a more limited view of God's abilities, which is supported scripturally.
So it is possible for God to know something and yet not be the cause of it.
Not when he also created absolutely everything involved while fully knowing the consequences of every single one of his creative actions.
Now, the better question that we really should be asking in this video is not necessarily why did God create Satan, but rather where did evil originate from in the mind and heart of Satan to begin with?
Good question. Because God is all-powerful, he could have made a system that allowed for free will but didn't allow for evil. In fact, such a system must exist, or else there isn't free will in heaven, and everyone that uses free will as an excuse for the existence of evil also does the same thing that Alan has done in this video, and has claimed that God gave us free will because without free will, love isn't really love. So then we die and go to heaven, which is paradise with no evil. So God must then strip us of our free will in order to get us into heaven, unless it is somehow possible to have free will exist simultaneously without the presence of evil, and with love being real love. In which case, God could have just saved everyone a huge headache and not sent anyone to hell if he had just made it that way in the first place. Now, in a response video where Braxton Hunter had a look at a previous video of mine dealing with a similar issue, they seem to come down on the side of free will existing in heaven, but when we get there we will just freely choose to not do evil things because we will know better by then. The example Braxton gave was of a 3-year-old child eating dirt. When the 3-year-old child grows up into an adult, the adult will freely choose to not eat dirt because now they know better. And us being here on Earth is the equivalent to being a 3-year-old, and when we're in heaven, we would be the adult who knows the consequences and will make the right choices. The thing is, though, if that is possible, then that means that it is also possible that God could have just made us with the knowledge of the consequences so that we would freely choose to make the right choice in the first place. They also say that because God is a maximally great being, then any other beings which he makes will necessarily not be maximally great because there can only be one maximally great being, which I would say that more maximally great beings are greater than one single maximally great being, so then God would necessarily make more and we would have a pantheon. But, you know, I don't know, I don't really study philosophy, so maybe I'm wrong there. Let's just say that's not the case. Could he not make beings with maximally great goodness that are not themselves maximally great beings? You can have maximal goodness without having unlimited power, can you not? But that's off topic. I just brought that up because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't putting any arguments out there that have been soundly refuted. I don't think that this one has been.
How is it possible for him to be a morally good being and then all of a sudden he turns out to be this immoral being causing so much trouble, and yet all the other angels
That's what you call a contradiction.
It does not matter how many angels did or did not cause trouble. It's not a problem of quantity, it's a problem of quality. God did shoddy work when he made the angels that went bad.
And sadly, unfortunately for this, we really cannot give an answer to this. We have to rely on Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29, which says, "The Lord our God has secrets known to no one. We are not accountable for them, but we and our children are accountable forever for all that he has revealed to us, so that we may obey all the terms of these instructions."
To paraphrase, if it doesn't make sense, it's mysterious ways. Now stop questioning it and obey.
So essentially, my friends, there is a lot of things that are very nebulous and confusing in terms of the origin of Satan. Whenever we read the Bible, we open it up in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. There is the presence of evil that we see in chapter 3, but not the explanation of how it got there.
Yeah, and you'd think a perfect being would be able to perfectly explain to his creation how he ended up not making a perfect creation. But here we are with him saying in Deuteronomy that some things just won't make sense to us because reasons, now obey me or else.
And then whenever you read some of the passages in Ezekiel chapter 28 and Isaiah chapter 14.
2 of those 3 verses that you have on screen are explicitly about earthly rulers, and yet they have made their way into mainstream theology as being about Satan, a character that didn't exist in anything close to the version that we have today until just before Jesus' time. And the third is basically an acid trip. And actually, verse 9 of the Revelation passage is the only place in the Bible where you could possibly infer that the Serpent of Eden was actually Satan. It doesn't explicitly state it, and Jesus calls the Pharisees serpents on occasion, so it could just be that serpent was an insult. But even if I pretend that it explicitly refers to the Eden story, this means that there was something like a 700-year gap between the composition of the Eden story and the recognition that the serpent character was Satan. That's a long time for God not to come clean about who really caused the fall.
And you try to piece together this existence, if you will, of some evil being, it just becomes very, very difficult in terms of how you interpret those passages. So there's a lot about Satan and his origin and how he came to being that the Bible is just silent on, and so it would be wrong for us to speak in areas that the Bible is silent on.
And yet, here we are, with you attributing characteristics to Satan based on passages written about earthly rulers, and speaking on Satan's origin, as if these passages don't explicitly mention which kings they were being written about.
But the good news for you and I is that regardless of how Satan got here, God one day is going to overcome all of the evil that we're experiencing on this earth, and that Satan is going to be bound forever and ever thrown and cast into the lake of fire.
I'm sure the billions of people who end up burning in the lake of fire with Satan feel much better about it, knowing that Satan will end up there too. Of course, Satan first got to roam free on Earth for thousands of years doing whatever he wanted, so he got to enjoy at least an order of magnitude more time on Earth than any of the people he's going to share hell with, but, you know, I'm sure they're happy with it.
And you and I, my friend, are going to spend eternity in the new heaven and in the new earth.
Oh, not me. I'm one of those people that's destined to share the lake of fire with Satan. Yeah, I get the same punishment as the guy who's responsible for every evil thing that has ever happened. My punishment for the sum total of all the bad things I ever do earns me the same punishment as Satan, who has so much evil to his name that no matter what I do in my life, all the bad things will not even be a blip on the radar compared to Satan. This would be like giving someone who breaks the speed limit the same jail sentence as a serial killer, except it's way more disproportionate than even that. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Ganulo, who says, LOL, he probably doesn't understand the X-Men either. Hint, it's an allegory about bigotry. This was on my Monday video, in which Dr. Jeff unironically brought up X-Men and the fact that we aren't evolving the ability to walk through walls as evidence against evolution. And he wasn't joking. I'm not even kidding here. That is one of his examples that he used. If you only watch one of my Dr. Jeff videos, that's the one to watch. But part of his video that I skipped was indeed him completely missing the point of the series. He kept talking about how Magneto wanted to exterminate all the humans, because Magneto isn't just a Homo sapien, he's a Homo superior. And he was discussing that as if that's the necessary outcome of an evolutionary worldview, the desire for the genocide of the lesser species. And he completely ignored the fact that Magneto is the bad guy of the series. Like, there's no question about that. He's the bad guy. Anyway, thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the maximally great beings who allow the flawed existence of my channel. If you'd like to be perfect by allowing imperfection to exist, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and P.O. Box address. See you next time.
Beware.
out of range.
Oh god, this is so confusing. I keep on trying to throw my shield. Because I'm used to, well, this being a paladin also now. And I'm just like, what is happening? Why? What? Are they out of sight? What is happening? Then I walk up to the enemy and I'm like, oh, I forgot. I forgot once again that I'm a fucking warrior. Warrior.
I'm out of range. I need to get closer. It's too far away. I'm out of range. I need to get closer. It's too far away.
Ilgenov. Ilgenov. Ilgenov.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I see the corruption
too far away.
I didn't have my hands on keyboard and mouse for a second. Oh no, shit.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I see the corruption within.
I'm out of range. I don't have
flesh peels away to expose rot.
I'm out of range. It's too far away.
I see the corruption within. 2, 1. God sees all. I see the corruption within. 2, 1. His gaze falls upon you. Those who pass beyond shall drown in the dark.
Contamination sanitized. Anchor deployment initiated.
Good work, champions. The world is better off without Il'gynoth and his maddening whispers. Though, take heed. His prophecies were meant to drive his victims insane. Now that he's gone,
Could have been worse. A little bit. But barely, it was already pretty bad.